Well, we're going to continue on in our sermon series. I came across this book called The Book of Failures, and this book obviously has many stories of humorous failures. My favorite probably is the one where an elderly lady in London, England, calls the fire department because her cat got caught up in that tree and she needed the cat to come down. And so the fire department came in a surprisingly quick amount of time, and they rescued the cat from the top of the tree. And the lady was so pleased with that. She said she urged them to come into her house, and she wanted to give them tea and crumpets and all that kind of thing, and thank them so much for what they had done for her cat. And they had a lovely time of visiting and so on, and they eventually went back into their trucks and their vehicles to leave. And as they were leaving the driveway, backed out their vehicles, they ran over the cat. And you're all laughing about that. You sick people, you know. And we come across those kind of things all the time. In fact, there's YouTube channels that are dedicated specifically to failures because we like to laugh at these kind of things. But not all failures, of course, are funny. Some failures are very serious and very damaging. There's a lot of woundedness and pain that is associated with that. Probably the most prominent one that we have heard of recently in our own country is Mr. Sidhu, who was a truck driver who failed to stop at the stop sign and ran into the bus that was carrying the Humboldt hockey team and killing 16 individuals and wounding many others. And there's nothing funny about that kind of a failure. His reaction, of course, was one of remorse. He pled guilty to all of the charges that were laid against him, and he experienced agony and turmoil over that situation. And so we know that there is agony and anguish, and sometimes that pain can leave scars in our life for the rest of our lives. Maybe you haven't had a failure as public or as significant as that, as dramatic as that, but we all know what it's like to experience the pain of failure. And we know that to be true in our spiritual life as well. When we make a decision to follow Jesus, that's actually one of the first things that we have to do. We actually have to admit that we are failures, that we cannot do anything to try to attain this perfection, this holiness that God demands, because He is a holy God. And for us to come in a relationship with Him, we actually have to admit that we are failures, that we have sin in our life, and we need Him to forgive us. But what happens when we continue to fail? What happens that after we become a believer, that there's still failure in a life, that we fall down on our face in the spiritual race that has been marked out for us? Where is God in that? What is our relationship like when we enter into these failures? Where is God when I cheat, when I lie, when I divorce, when I lose my temper, when I get a DUI, or when I get off on a warning for a speeding ticket? When I view porn, or when I have an affair, when I hate, when I gossip, when I slander, when I get high, when I betray everything that I know to be right, and there's a mockery of my belief of God. Where is God in those failures? Maybe we can twist the question a little bit, and that is to ask the question, where do I want God to be? And I think many of us might say, well, I want God to be a million miles away during that moment. I don't want the holiness of God to be holding me accountable in those very particular moments. It would be very frightening and very scary for that to happen. And so I would rather hide or try to deny or lie about it, or just wish that God just wouldn't even show up and that He wouldn't care. And so we have a tendency to actually move away from God during those moments of our failures. But is that really what we want? Is that really what we want to have in our relationship with God? Do we want it to be more? And maybe in our sober moments, we might be able to say to ourselves, well, actually, it would be wonderful. I mean, maybe it's a pipe dream, but maybe it would be wonderful if we could actually have God meet us where we are at, even in the midst of our failures, that He would be able to look at us and love us and accept us and forgive us and give us another chance. Wouldn't that be amazing? I've entitled this message called What Happens After the Rooster Crows, and it's based upon, as you might have guessed, about Peter's denial and what happened after the rooster crows. Peter had a major failure. It was a doozy. It was a big one. And even if you can't identify with that particular failure, we can all identify with the failures that we have had in our spiritual life and our walk with God. So what happens after we fail? What happens after the rooster crows? As we've been going through the Gospel of John, we have seen Peter. We have noticed that Peter is a disciple that Jesus personally called Peter to be one of his disciples, not only one of the 12, but also one of the inner three, the circle, the intimate circle of friends that Jesus had. We know that Jesus was bringing Peter into this relationship where not only was he being taught, but he was also being molded and mentored, and he was destined to be something more. He was about to be a leader, and Jesus wanted to build something on this rock that he called Peter. At the Last Supper, Jesus told his disciples that he was about to be betrayed and to be crucified, and Peter got all upset about what was being told him, and he stood up and said, he boldly declared, Lord, and Jesus just finished telling them that all the disciples are going to be disappearing and falling away, and Peter says, by no means. Even if everyone else deserts you, I will never desert you. And Peter is saying, I'm your man, Jesus. You can count on me. I will never let you down. Others might let you down, but I certainly will not. Even if I have to die for you, I will never deny you. And Jesus looks at him right in the eye, and he says, Peter, will you really lay down your life for me? Really? Very truly, I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Imagine what Peter must have felt like when Jesus said that. He must have been stunned. He must have been taken aback by that prediction of Jesus. And I'm sure that Peter, right at that moment, was making this even more firm commitment in his heart that I will never deny my Lord. And he made that commitment deep within his heart, and maybe that's what was happening at that moment last Sunday when we were talking about the arrest of Jesus, and he had this overkill of soldiers, 600 soldiers coming to arrest Jesus, and Peter is all excited about this, and he starts swinging his sword, and it's a miracle that Peter wasn't killed in the midst of that. Peter was convinced that he wasn't going to let Jesus down. He was going to go down dying if need be. And so this is where we pick up the story in John chapter 18. Right after Jesus was arrested, he was brought to the high priest for trial. And it says this in verse 15. Simon Peter followed Jesus, as did another of the disciples. Now it's not clear who that disciple was. Some scholars believe it was John, the author of the gospel. But that other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, so he was allowed to enter into the high priest's courtyard with Jesus. Peter had to stay outside the gate. Then the disciple who knew the high priest spoke to the woman watching at the gate, and she let Peter in. And the woman asked Peter, "You are not one of that man's disciples, are you?" "No," he said, "I am not." Because it was cold, the household servants and the guards had made a charcoal fire. Pay attention to that. We'll get back to it. They stood around it, warming themselves, and Peter stood with them, warming himself. Verse 25, meanwhile, as Simon Peter was standing by the fire, warming himself, they asked him again, "You are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it, saying, "No, I am not." But one of the household slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Didn't I see you out there in the olive grove with Jesus?" Again, Peter denied it, and immediately a rooster crowed. No matter how you look at this is a major, major failure. This is not just the raw fact that Peter denied knowing Jesus, but this is Peter as a disciple, as an intimate disciple, disowning his master and his Lord, the one who had spent 3 years listening and learning, watching miracles, laughing, celebrating. He had gone public with his commitment that he said he would never, ever deny his Lord, that he would be the last man standing if necessary. Jesus designated him to be a leader, a foundation on which he would build his church. He changed his name from Simon to Peter, which means rock, saying, "This is what I'm going to build on you." But in a single night, in a single event, even after Jesus warned Peter, he denied even knowing Jesus. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. And when the rooster crowed, I can imagine all of these words that Peter had said come crashing down on him, all of his bravado, all of his spiritual confidence, all of his bragging about how he was going to be the last person standing for Jesus, and this is what he did. It came crashing down on him, and Peter was anything but a rock. Have you ever done something that you knew was wrong? You knew you shouldn't have done it, but you did it anyway. Maybe you even vowed that you would never do it again, and you did. If you've been there, if you've experienced that, you know that there's a lot of heartache, a lot of pain, a lot of anguish, a lot of shame and guilt and fear that is associated with that. And this is what Peter felt. He was sick to his stomach. Now, John doesn't record it for us, but all 3 other Gospels do mention that Peter left from there and he wept bitterly. He was in complete agony over what he had just done. Everything else that Jesus had predicted did come true. Jesus was crucified, he was buried, and on the 3rd day when Mary Magdalene went to go to the tomb, she found that the stone had been rolled away and that Jesus was no longer there, and then it began to be, the news started to spread that Jesus was alive and well. But where was Peter? Where was Peter? And what was going through his mind? What was he thinking? What was the relationship with Jesus going to be like? Would Jesus ever be able to forgive him? Would Jesus reject him? Because Peter knew for sure that he deserved to be rejected. In fact, Peter deserved eternal damnation. That's probably what some of the things were going through his mind. And yet he knew that Jesus was a gracious and a generous man, but he also knew that he was holy. And what Peter had done himself, he felt, how is there anything worse that I could do against my Lord and my Master? Can you see the anguish that was going on with Peter and just going back and forth, wondering, is he going to be accepted or is he going to be rejected? How is he going to deal with all of this? Longing for forgiveness, but feeling the weight of what he had just done. And so what did he do? The same thing that a lot of us might do. He figured that if Jesus had given up on him, then he may as well give up on Jesus. Surely Jesus wouldn't accept him back. And so that means that he has to move on without him. Have you ever experienced that? That you are afraid to go back in relationship with Jesus? That it's just too hard? So Peter went back to what he was doing before he met Jesus. He went fishing. This is something that he knew what to do. And we know that this is what was happening when Jesus first met Peter. The Gospel of Luke records for that early meeting that Jesus had with Peter. Peter, James, and John were out fishing. They had fished all night long. And Jesus shows up and he says, "Hey, guys, I want you to go and try again." And I imagine Peter must have been exasperated by that. I mean, they had just been fishing all night long. They're just terribly tired. But Peter decided to humor Jesus and said, "Okay, we'll go out if you say so." And Jesus says, I want to show you this time where you are to fish. And so as they did, as they responded, as Peter followed the instructions, with great amazement, the nets began to fill with fish. And then all of a sudden, Peter was profoundly aware that he was in the presence of somebody who was much greater than he had ever imagined. And Luke 5, verse 8, it says, when Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." Those are very true words that Peter spoke. He is a sinful man. But look at how he responds. "Go away from me. I can't stand you to be in my presence because I'm a sinful human being." How did Jesus respond? Well, Jesus didn't go away. Jesus' response was simply, "Peter, I want you to follow me. Follow me." So that was 3 years ago. Now we're back into this setting. This is following the denial that Peter just had. And once again, Peter is, in essence, he has said to Jesus to go away. "I'm a sinful man." And Peter abandons God. He went back fishing. And some of the disciples actually went with him as well. But then something very unusual happens. And then we pick up again in John. It says, "Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, 'Friends, haven't you any fish?' 'No,' they answered. He said, 'Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some.' And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved," that's referring to John, "when he said to Peter, 'It is the Lord,' as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, 'It is the Lord,' he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, jumped into the water, and the other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire burning coals there with fish on it and some bread." So this is the resurrected Jesus, 3 years after he first met Peter. And the parallel is remarkable. Here we have Peter fishing and not catching anything. Maybe you should change professions. And the stranger comes along and says, "Try the other side of the boat." Peter obeys. A miracle happens, and the net becomes filled with fish. What was Jesus doing? Why did he do this again? What was it communicating to Peter? Is it possible that Jesus was saying, you can have a new start? It is possible to be fresh and have a relationship with me. So when they got ashore, Jesus was standing near a charcoal fire, the same fire that Peter had stood by when he had denied Jesus. What a vivid reminder of Peter's failure. So what happened? Next verse, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." And then Jesus said to Peter, "Follow me." Isn't this a fascinating conversation? Did you notice, first of all, how Jesus addressed Peter? He didn't call him Peter. He called him Simon, son of John. This is actually a very formal kind of way of addressing him. And it is before he changed his name to Peter, Simon, son of John. There's a very serious kind of tone in Jesus' address. It's obvious that Jesus wanted to debrief with Peter, so to speak. This untalked about thing that happened, that Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. Do we not need to address this? And it's a very sensitive issue. And so how does Jesus do it? Well, notice what Jesus didn't do. He didn't ask, "What were you thinking, Peter? Do you promise that you will never do this again? Are you sorry for what you've done?" Jesus didn't ask those kinds of questions. Rather, he asked, "Do you love me?" Is that surprising? Does that seem a little odd when you think about it? You know, I mentioned in the beginning of the message about Mr. Sidhu, who had ran the stop sign and caused this terrible accident where several people were killed. And one of the mothers of the hockey player that was killed read a victim impact statement recently. And she believed very firmly that Mr. Sidhu did not deserve forgiveness. This is what she said. She looked right at him in his eye and she said this, "I despise you for taking my baby away. You are an arrogant and inconsiderate monster with no regard for life or rules or laws." Out of her deep anguish and grief and pain, these words came forth. And these are the kinds of words that we often think of when somebody has experienced the atrocity and the damage of someone's failure. But Jesus' response is in remarkable contrast to that. The first thing on God's mind is not, "How could you be so stupid?" or "You're a monster," or "I will never forgive you." The first thing on God's mind is, "Do you love me?" New Testament scholar Murray Harris comments on this, and he says, "First things first. When we sin, it is our betrayal, it is our disowning of Jesus." Jesus didn't call Peter, he did not call him Peter because the question was whether Simon wanted to be Peter. Did he want to be a rock for Jesus? Because when we sin, we're the ones that turn away. The first thing on Jesus' mind is to restore Peter. But it was up to Peter if it was going to happen. Because Jesus is saying essentially to Peter, "Peter, I love you, I accept you, and I want to have a restoration. I want to have a relationship with you. I want to be close. I want to be intimate with you. But the question is, do you? Do you want that?" Well, you might be quick to say, if Jesus comes to us and says, "I love you and I want to have an intimate relationship with you and I'm ready to forgive you," you would say, "Yes, of course, I want that." Who wouldn't want that? But think very carefully about what Jesus is asking. Because to love Jesus isn't simply to say that I want Jesus, or I believe in Jesus, or I'll even do things for Jesus, or that, I'm going to go to church for Jesus, because you can do all those things and not actually love Jesus. To love Jesus really means to be ready to be confronted by our own sin, by our own failures, to confess and to repent and to be restored by God. To be in relationship with God means that He is the King, that we are entering the kingdom of God, that He is the Supreme One, He is our leader, He is our master, and we listen and we obey and we respond because He is the one that is in charge. To be in relationship with God means to be honest about who we are and who He is. So Jesus asked Peter that question, and He asked it 3 times, no doubt, pointing out and reminding Peter of the 3 times that he had denied Him. And Jesus wants Peter to know, do you love me? So how did Peter answer? Well, Peter did not answer, "Well, of course I love you." Isn't it obvious? Because it wasn't obvious. Because the actions of Peter did not show an obvious example of love. He had just betrayed Him 3 times. He had shown anything but love. But what did Peter say? He said, "You know that I love you. You know that I love you." I want you to think about that for a moment. Because he was saying, "Jesus, you know everything. You know where my heart is. You know me even beyond my actions, even beyond my own sin. You know that I love you. You know it's deep inside." And I do believe that Peter did love Jesus. Even though he failed spectacularly, he loved Jesus. his heart was towards God. In essence, Peter is saying, Jesus, you know, both you and I know what happened, but you also know beyond that. You know that I love you. And after each time Jesus asked the question, each time he said, okay, Peter, well then get back into the game. Don't let your sin be the last word and allow that to define who you are. Do not run from me. Do not run from your calling. Do not go back to your old life. Peter, I want you to follow me. Those exact same words that Jesus said to Peter the first time, and that's what caused Peter to drop his nets and to leave everything and to follow Jesus. And Jesus says it again, and he does it at the charcoal fire, the same fire that represented the failure where Peter denied Jesus. And now, this fire is representing something else. It's representing forgiveness and healing and restoration. A second chance. The forgiveness that Jesus offers is not just for Peter, of course, it is for all of us. God offers complete and total forgiveness to anyone who wants it. When Jesus said on the cross, it is finished, he is referring to the sacrifice that he had offered for us, for all of our sins, up until that time and up until the rest of our lives. Jesus offered forgiveness for all of it. Jesus came not to condemn, but he came to forgive, to save. He came to offer a new life. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't serious consequences to sin, because there are. That doesn't mean that God takes sin lightly, because he doesn't. That doesn't mean that we can't learn from our sins, because we can. But sin doesn't have to be the last word. It doesn't have to define who you are. It doesn't have to have the last say and the last verdict about who you are. Because of what Jesus did on the cross, he offers forgiveness. And he says, and our opportunity then is to say, I'm sorry. I really do love you. Please forgive me. And Jesus' response will be, all right, let's start over. Follow me. That's what can happen after the rooster crows. You know, I've had a lot of people come to me over the years saying that they cannot believe that God would ever forgive them for what they have done, either because they feel that the sin that they have committed is so great, it's so atrocious that God would never be able to forgive them, or maybe they felt that God has already given them the second and third chance and God has lost patience, or any number of things that there's just no way, there's no hope, and they're scared to death to face God. Peter felt the same way. He was scared. He didn't know what was going to happen, but when he did meet Jesus, something so radical and so powerful, so profound, that Peter he barely knew how to respond. God is the God of forgiveness. God is the God of second and third and fourth chances and the 100th chance. He is a God of new beginnings, no matter how many times it is needed. The cross is there for you. There is a fire built for you, and Jesus is calling you to come and stand with him. But first things first, do you love him?